Over the past few decades, vampires have quite literally lost their bite. At least since the beginning of the 90s, the hazy foggy figure of the Big V has seemingly become completely detached of its folkloristic roots as well as its literary tradition. Nowadays, it is embedded in the pop cultural zeitgeist as a glimmering, angsty teenage love interest that has the forbidden lure of a half-smoked cigarette at worst, or it spreads the vibe of an alter ego drawing scribbled into a black velvet sketchbook by an edgy goth teen at slightly less worse. However, John Polidori's original concept of the vampire, as he introduced it to literature in 1816, is actually pretty much everyone's worst nightmare. It's just that everyone has forgotten about that. His bloodsucker, dandyman Lord Ruthven, is a being whose sole purpose lies in the misery it causes to everyone it encounters. Not interested in anything else except the torture of all things alive, the original vampire doesn't draw blood from its victims for simple self-sustainment, but much more to cause someone else crippling feelings of grief and hopeless despair as they see a loved one fall unexplainably ill or getting turned into a coconut with a straw right in front of them. The true victim is not the person that is getting deprived of their life in the physical sense, but the closest person to them getting deprived of a life with their loved one. In that sense, OG V-Boy Lord Ruthven is pretty much like a spider, just without a real appetite and instead an insatiable hunger for sadism. He entangles everyone in his net and slowly infuses venom into their bodies to dissolve them before his eyes, bit by bit. For funsies. Now, not everyone may be familiar with the lore, but everyone knows the Count. And if you read Bram Stoker's novel, Count Dracula isn't very far behind Lord Ruthven when it comes to the dimension of his misanthropic endeavors. But even renowned filmmaker Francis Ford Coppola forgot all about that in his 1992 adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel, though curiously he insisted on the title Bram Stoker's Dracula as to leave no doubt behind about how close to the original source his movie was going to be. He fucked it all up though nonetheless with turning the Count from this to this. Melodrama to the max. Please clear your tear glands, human emotions incoming. Now, the shiz we got going with the most famous recent vampires in postmodern times, like the bloodless Twilight dudes, Vampire Diary divas, and True Blood soap opera singers, is basically an evolution of Coppola's humanized Dracula. In other words, they are the evolution of an already watered-down version of an originally menacing demonic monster distilled into an empty husk of terror, filled instead with romanticized pseudo-tragical emotions, exuding as much authenticity as porn does. It's the ultra-compressed result of a trend clearly visible on its high wave in the 90s, started by Bram Stoker's Dracula and followed by Interview with the Vampire. Because of this, the concept and idea of what a large portion of us think of when we hear the word vampire has turned into something that occupies the same cultural space as softcore paperbacks for elderly women, self-insert fanfiction, and OG Sonic characters do. Now, imagine how refreshing it felt to discover a piece of media coexisting in the same time-space as our beautiful cryboys of the 90s, but offering a completely different take on the vampire figure that stands in total opposition to the trend of its time. That piece of media is Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver.
Patreon shit, bitch, hoes and tricks. Patreon shit, bitch, hoes and tricks. Patreon shit, bitch, hoes and tricks. Donating motherfuckers, they pay my shit.
In Soul Reaver, vampires have literally transformed into the monsters they were always meant to represent, something hellish and ghoulish, only masquerading as human like Lord Ruthven. Though here the costume party has been over for a long time already now, so to say. It's just that peeps are still dragging themselves across the living room carpet, all drunk and drugged out like after a particularly bad patch of chemical cocktails and Bloody Marys. The reason for that is that Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver is taking place in a post-apocalyptic world in which humans have been decimated to what feels like a mere gaunty dozen. Of course, there are a few more around than that, but those have to hide from their predators, like cockroaches and silverfishes hide in moist crevices and dark corners. To top it all off, our protagonist, the favored child of Nosferatu overlord Kain, loses the favor of his father, gets his wings ripped to shreds and thrown into a soul-sucking maelstrom where he hangs in limbo for a good 1,000 years before Cthulhu revives him and is all like, "Thou hast slumbered long enough. The constellation of the planets has reached the time for you to pimp slap your whole brothers." And so, Raziel, now a zombified soul-sucking Tomb Raider ghoul, gets back into the material world and becomes a material girl once again to pay his family a visit. That time skip though has done them vampire boys no good. Raziel himself sure does not look his best compared to his rather sexual goth DiCaprio former self, and when he encounters other vampires for the first time, he doesn't even recognize them as such. Their physiognomy barely retaining an anthropomorphic form, their human skin camouflage melted into thin air over the course of the last millennia, revealing the alien monstrous makeup of what lay beneath it the whole time. Animalistic predators feasting on the living, stabbing their victims with their long tongues, sucking them dry of any fluids. It's a rather ghastly sight that has nothing in common anymore with the highly sexualized and fetishized media-processed act of biting a young maiden's neck to draw blood from it and consume it either all highbrow like a refined glass of wine or getting all steamy and hot, so the consumers get so hyped up by it that they reenact it after the movie's over and it's time for the sheets. To Raziel, this comes as a shock. And to me as well. This is not the noble breed of vampires that he has known in his time, and I love that. It's a rather ingenious take on the whole vampire motif that allowed the design team at Eidos to take creative liberties which would not retread completely old ground but still harken back to what made the vampire such a terrifying creature to begin with. Its inhumanity. Scaly exoskeletons covering the humanoid shape of two-legged purple-skinned leeches that escalate the inherent subtext of vampirism, parasitism, into literal visible shape and form. Uncannily long-limbed spider goblins that cling to the walls like the empty dried-up husk of an insect shell, only to morph into a panic-inducing flail of erratically moving extremities, spinning their victims into cocoons and harvesting them when their thin, spindly bodies start to run low on energy. Anthropoid serpent creatures gliding through the dark waters of flooded ruins and towering ogres turning the innate blasphemic notion of the vampire mythos outward as some kind of hellish freak fusion between bats and Baphomets. In Soul Reaver, this is the embodiment of the undead species evolution / degeneracy / outward manifestation of the always de facto inherent monstrosity we are so seldomly reminded of in modern presentations and interpretations of this myth. It is such a different take on the whole idea and concept of the creature in comparison to what we are used to nowadays. The 5 children of Kain, however, take this to a different extreme, where one has become an amorphous blob covered in elephantine tumors that turn its body into something completely degenerated, almost slug-like without any resemblance to what it was before. Another has transformed into an insectoid xenomorphic art house installation, like a crossing between a monstrous mantis and the inside of an anthill, merging with the architecture of a giant cathedral, turning it into part of his body as well as his and his children's nest. The face of his former self has only remained as a form of mimicry, unable to be maintained and breaking literally into pieces as soon as he reveals his true fiendish nature and intent. These aren't traditional bloodsuckers anymore. These are, quite literally, in the most blatant sense of the word, monsters. They are the worst components of the vampire makeup, manifested in grotesque physical shape, bringing its deprived evil nature, its original terror, back into the realm of visual representation that has been hollowed out by the likes of Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise some 27 years ago. They are what Lord Ruthven and Count Dracula very likely look on the inside. Turning that inside visually outwards is the brilliance of Soul Reaver. That this lineage and take on the figure and concept of such a beloved, albeit by now cliched, horror trope feels so novel in 2021 makes it kind of a head-scratcher to me how the vampire turned into a tragic, empathic type of monster before artists concentrated on exaggerating the demonic, cruel, and sadistic nature of the source material. I guess it comes down to that if something is disregarded and discontinued for long enough, it will inevitably feel fresh again. The old-fashioned at one point seems to always transcend its initial outdatedness and transforms into an alternative to the established norm that it once represented itself. If the sardonic viciousness of Lord Ruthven and OG Dracula would have had a bigger influence on the postmodern mainstream representation of vampires, then maybe I wouldn't be talking about Soul Reaver and its relatives here, but instead of how ingenious it is of Interview with the Vampire or Twilight to make our beloved human bats emotional, gullible, and sexy. As it stands, truly cruel, animalistic, and monstrous vampires are still lurking in the shadows of media, but they are slowly making their way back into bigger pop culture artifacts. Thankfully. I hope people will embrace that. But I'm just toting my own horn here. You're allowed to be in love with your pale, sexy vamp boys. Have some fun, suck some.